In May 1993, the city of Houston, Texas, became the scene of a domestic tragedy that would echo for decades. Willie Tyrone Trottie, a 24-year-old man consumed by jealousy and anger, walked into the home of his estranged girlfriend, Barbara Canada, carrying a gun and a promise he had made many times before: "If you don't come back to me, I will kill you." Inside the house that night was Barbara, her brother Titus, and other family members. Within minutes, Trottie opened fire. Barbara was shot multiple times, Titus was killed trying to protect his sister, and the family was left shattered. The violence was so shocking, so preventable, that it became one of Houston's most haunting cases of domestic violence turned deadly. Trottie insisted it was self-defense, that he had been shot at first, but prosecutors saw it differently. They painted a picture of a man who could not let go, who turned his obsession into murder. A jury agreed, and Willie Tyrone Trottie was sentenced to die. For 21 years, he fought the courts, filing appeal after appeal, arguing ineffective lawyers, hidden evidence, even the cruelty of Texas's lethal injection drugs. None of it worked. On September 10, 2014, Trottie was led into the Huntsville death chamber. His last meal was nothing special: baked chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, bread, and a drink, the same as every other inmate after Texas banned special last requests. His final words were directed to the family of his victims: "I hope this brings you some closure. Find it in your hearts to forgive me. I'm sorry. I love you all. I'm going home, going to be with the Lord. Jesus, take me home." It took 22 minutes for the lethal injection to end his life. To understand how love, control, and fear spiraled into murder, and how the man responsible faced his fate 2 decades later with a mix of apology and resignation, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a case that doesn't just tell the story of a crime. It tells the story of family destroyed and a man who could not let go. Born in 1969, Willie Tyrone Trottie came into a world of challenges in Houston, Texas, a city marked by its vibrant culture, but also deep social struggles. Those who knew him his early years described him as quiet, often reserved, but also carrying a troubled streak beneath the surface. He did not come from privilege, and like many young men in his community, he was forced to navigate a life where opportunities were scarce and family tensions often ran high. As he grew older, he found it difficult to maintain stable relationships, wrestling with issues of control, insecurity, and jealousy that would follow him into adulthood. By the late 1980s, Trottie entered into a romantic relationship with a young woman named Barbara Canada, a woman known for her bright spirit and strong ties to her family. At first, the relationship appeared like any other young romance, but over time, it began to shift. Friends and relatives recalled that Trottie became increasingly possessive, his love for Barbara morphing into something darker, something more dangerous. What began as affection slowly transformed into arguments, threats, and an imbalance of power. Their romance, once filled with promise, turned unstable, controlling, and ultimately, as history would show, fatal. Barbara Canada was remembered by friends and family as a young woman full of life, described as bright, determined, and deeply devoted to her loved ones. She carried herself with quiet confidence, working to build a future for herself and leaning on the close bond of her family, who stood by her through life's challenges. Among them was her brother, Titus Canada, a protective figure whom many described as the kind of brother everyone wanted: caring, loyal, and willing to stand up for those he loved without hesitation. When Barbara decided to end her relationship with Willie Tyrone Trottie after years of increasing conflict and controlling behavior, it was Titus who made it clear that he would protect his sister at any cost. Barbara, fearing for her safety, took the difficult step of filing for a restraining order, seeking the help of the courts to keep Trottie away. But what she hoped would bring peace only inflamed his anger further. To Willie, the end of their relationship was not something he was willing to accept, and to Titus, his role as protector meant standing directly in the path of that danger. Together, brother and sister embodied love and resilience. But tragically, both would become victims of Trottie's rage on that fateful night in 1993. Court records and testimony paint a chilling picture of the relationship between Willie Tyrone Trottie and Barbara Canada in the months leading up to the murders. What began as a romance between two young adults had deteriorated into a cycle of jealousy, control, and constant threats. Friends and relatives would later recall how Barbara confided in them about the terrifying phone calls she received, calls in which Trottie's voice carried both desperation and menace. Time and again, he warned her that if she refused to come back to him, if she dared to live her life without him, he would make good on his threats. At one point, he told her in no uncertain terms, "If you don't come back to me, I will kill you." To Barbara, these weren't empty words. She believed him. She took the warnings seriously, going so far as to seek a restraining order, hoping the justice system could shield her from the danger she sensed was coming. Her family, too, lived in fear, watching her grow more anxious with each day that passed, knowing that Trottie's anger was escalating. But despite her efforts to protect herself, the threats only intensified, becoming not just words spoken in anger, but a grim promise of violence that Barbara and her loved ones could no longer ignore. On the night of May 3, 1993, violence struck the Canada family home in Houston. Willie Tyrone Trottie, consumed by rage and armed with a gun, arrived at the residence where Barbara had been staying with her family. Determined to carry out the threats he had made in the weeks prior, he forced his way inside. What followed was a scene of chaos and terror. Barbara and her relatives were suddenly confronted by the man she had tried desperately to escape, and in an instant, the night erupted in gunfire. Witnesses later recounted how Trottie moved with chilling purpose, firing multiple rounds as the family scattered in fear. Barbara, the woman at the center of his obsession, was struck repeatedly, collapsing as her loved ones screamed around her. Her brother, Titus, leapt forward to protect his sister, but in the exchange of gunfire, he too was fatally shot. The house, once a safe haven, had become a war zone, and by the time the shooting ended, 2 lives were lost: Barbara Canada, a young woman whose only crime was wanting freedom, and her brother Titus, whose last act was one of courage and sacrifice. Police report excerpt voiceover. The suspect fired multiple rounds, striking Barbara Canada in the chest and Titus Canada fatally in the head. In the days following the shooting, Houston police moved swiftly to track down and arrest Willie Tyrone Trottie. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses, including members of Barbara's own family who had survived the terrifying night, identified him without hesitation as the shooter. Investigators collected physical evidence and pieced together a timeline that pointed directly to Trottie's calculated decision to storm into the Canada home. Perhaps most damaging to his defense was the protective order Barbara had filed before her death, a legal document that stood as proof she had feared for her life and had sought help from the courts. To detectives and prosecutors alike, this was not an impulsive crime committed in the heat of the moment, but rather the culmination of weeks of threats, intimidation, and obsession. When Trottie was brought into custody, his mugshot captured the face of a man who had crossed the line from jealousy into cold-blooded murder. For the Canada family, the arrest brought a measure of relief, but it also marked the beginning of a long and painful journey through the justice system. In 1993, Willie Tyrone Trottie stood trial in a Texas courtroom, facing charges of capital murder for the deaths of Barbara and Titus Canada. The prosecution built a powerful case, presenting Barbara's restraining order, witness testimony from her terrified family members, and the evidence gathered at the crime scene. They argued that Trottie had carefully planned the attack, forcing his way into the Canada family home and carrying out the very threats he had made for weeks. To the state, this was not a man defending himself, but one determined to kill, fulfilling a chilling promise to the woman who had rejected him. The defense countered with a different story, claiming that Trottie had been shot at first and acted in self-defense, insisting that the events spiraled out of control in the heat of the moment. But the jury was not convinced. After deliberating, they returned a unanimous verdict of guilty, concluding that the crime was deliberate and premeditated. In the penalty phase, The jury weighed whether Trottie posed a continuing threat to society and whether there were mitigating factors to spare his life. Ultimately, they answered those questions with a resounding yes to death. The sentence was clear. Willie Tyrone Trottie would be executed by lethal injection. For the Canada family, the verdict provided justice, but no verdict could erase the pain of losing Barbara and Titus in such a brutal way. For more than 2 decades following his conviction, Willie Tyrone Trottie's case wound its way through the labyrinth of the American appeals system. His attorneys argued tirelessly on his behalf, claiming that his trial counsel had been ineffective, that key mitigating evidence about his troubled past was never fully presented, and that certain testimony had been unfairly suppressed. They challenged the constitutionality of Texas's lethal injection protocol, citing concerns about whether the drugs used could cause unnecessary pain and suffering, pointing to national debates over executions that were unfolding in the courts at the time. At every stage, from the state appellate courts to the federal Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the same answer echoed back. His conviction and sentence would stand. Judges consistently ruled that the evidence of premeditation and intent was overwhelming, and that no procedural error or constitutional issue justified overturning the verdict. Appeal after appeal was denied, and each denial brought him closer to the fate sealed by the jury in 1993. By the spring of 2014, after more than 20 years of filings, hearings, and last-minute stays, the legal road had run out. The courts issued their final rejection, and the state of Texas set an execution date for September of that year. After decades of litigation, Trottie's journey through the justice system had reached its end, and the countdown to his execution officially began. After more than 2 decades of appeals and legal battles, Willie Tyrone Trottie spent his final days confined within the concrete walls of Texas's Polunsky Unit, the state's notorious death row facility. Inside his solitary cell, with little more than a bed, a sink, and the echo of his own thoughts, Trottie faced the reality that his time was slipping away. He spent long hours writing letters, trying to leave behind words for those on the outside, and preparing himself for what he knew was inevitable. In his final visits, family members came to see him, some offering quiet comfort, others torn between grief and anger at what his actions had cost. Guards noted that he appeared reflective, though resigned, often pacing his cell or sitting in silence. Every movement of the clock pushed him closer to his appointed hour. For Trottie, who had once lived a life filled with conflict and violence, the stillness of death row offered a stark reminder of the consequences of his choices. As September 2014 approached, he understood with certainty that there would be no more appeals, no more last-minute reprieves. Only the short walk from his cell to the death chamber in Huntsville. With each passing day, the walls of the Polunsky Unit seemed to close tighter, and Trottie's world narrowed to a final countdown that no man could escape. By the time Willie Tyrone Trottie faced his execution in September of 2014, Texas had already ended the long-standing tradition of allowing condemned inmates to request a special last meal. That policy had been abolished in 2011 after controversy over extravagant final meal requests, and from then on, every prisoner received only the standard tray served to the general inmate population. For Trottie, there would be no elaborate choice, no personal request to mark his final night. Instead, like every other man behind those walls, his last dinner was the routine fare of the Huntsville unit. A portion of baked chicken served with green beans, a scoop of mashed potatoes, a slice of plain bread, and a small drink. It was simple, unremarkable, and stripped of symbolism. Yet for a man whose life had been consumed by violence and legal battles, it was the quiet, unceremonious ritual that preceded his walk to the death chamber. His last meal, ordinary and unchanging, marked the end of more than 2 decades of waiting. A reminder that in the end, the state allowed no privilege, no exception, and no indulgence for those condemned to die. On the evening of September 10, 2014, the long journey from courtroom to death row reached its final stop at the Huntsville unit, Texas's oldest and most infamous prison, known simply as the Walls. It was here, behind its heavy steel doors, that Willie Tyrone Trottie faced the ultimate consequence for the murders of Barbara and Titus Canada, committed more than 2 decades earlier. As the clock struck 6:30 p.m., he was escorted into the small death chamber, laid on the gurney, and strapped down with heavy leather restraints across his arms, legs, and chest. A curtain separated him from the witnesses, members of the Canada family on one side, his own relatives on the other. Needles were inserted into his veins, and the clear, lethal drugs prepared to flow. Outside the prison, crowds gathered in silence, some seeking justice, others calling for mercy, the candlelight vigil casting a soft glow against the darkening Texas sky. According to official reports, the execution began promptly, and the process lasted about 22 minutes before a prison official pronounced him dead. What struck many was not just the solemn ritual of the state's ultimate punishment, but the final words Trottie chose to speak, a mixture of apology, remorse, and faith. Last words, voiceover. I hope this brings you some closure. Find it in your hearts to forgive me. I'm sorry. I love you all. I'm going home, going to be with the Lord. Jesus, take me home. What do you think about the story of Willie Tyrone Trottie and the tragic loss of Barbara and Titus Canada? Do you believe justice was served, or should his appeals have changed the outcome? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime stories, and leave your comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the True Crime Report Network for more real-life cases, deep dives, and execution stories that continue to shape the conversation around crime and justice.